Well, this is a good question. If you poll the American public and ask them that question, and or the question, does money in politics corrupt the political process, overwhelming belief that that's the case, right? There's too much money in politics, it's corrupting. If you pose the poll question slightly differently, what are the top 100 issues facing America today? Certainly prior to Citizens United, this whole role of money and the regulation of money in politics wouldn't show up at all. It probably would show up somewhere down the list today, simply because of a lot of the attention that's been drawn to this issue by Citizens United. But it's not up there with unemployment or healthcare or immigration. It just isn't there. So, but then the question is, what brings money into politics and what is that money used for? So, the overwhelming source of money in politics is from individuals. And it's estimated that the 2012 election cycle, over $6 billion might well have been spent, all told, not just by candidates and parties, but interest groups and third parties, one sort of the next. And by far, the principal source of that is individuals. But it's a very, very small number of individuals relative to sort of the age eligible, which turns out to be anybody because minors can contribute. So the entire US population is potentially a contributor to the political process. It's a tiny, tiny sliver. So it's not part of political participation that most people, or even the vast majority of people, participate in. But but there's some motives, right? There's different motives. So as a small contributor, I might, from an ideological point of view, okay, I like these guys versus those guys, basically for the sort of the policies that they generally support. So I'll give to a Democrat, or I'll give to a Republican, or a Green, or a Libertarian. Purely for ideological sympathy kinds of reasons, right? And that's probably where most of the money's coming from, right? You're giving to people that talk like you, think like you, not for any particular favor. But there is that corner of the world, and that's certainly what captures most people's imagination, which is they want something for the amount of money that they're putting into the process. And this is where you get concerned about whether there's a certain level of corruption, that politicians are doing favors on behalf of their contributors. Now, it turns out if you actually go look at, try and relate the money coming into members of Congress and how they vote on bills, it turns out it's very, very difficult to find that relationship. And that's for a lot of reasons. First of all, the amount of money isn't a tremendous amount. I mean, corporate political action committees probably aren't giving, on average, more than $1,000, which in multi-million-dollar, even House races now, certainly Senate races and presidential races, that's a drop in the bucket. So would some politicians sell their soul for $1,000? Well, probably some, but not many. But there is that element in terms of the motives, and that's what people get most concerned about, is that's where the potential for corruption lies, and certainly the motives of some small segment of the participants in the political process, no question. It's an investment, right? I'm going to particularly say corporate political action committee money, or even some of this other money that's coming in. So that's where people get worried about the amount of money in politics. On the other hand, there's a lot of evidence that because most of this money goes to political advertising, that voters actually benefit. There's evidence that they actually learn something about candidates, about policies, that they probably wouldn't have otherwise learned as a consequence of all this political advertising. So where that comes out on balance it's not clear. But if you think about the people, let's go to that segment that's looking for something, and think about the size of the potential benefits from getting something done for you that's favorable for you by the political process, a favorable regulation, subsidies, farm subsidies, green energy subsidies, petrochemical subsidies, you name it. And you look at the scale of the benefits that the government has shown to be able to give and willing to give, relative to what amounts to a trivial political investment. The rate of return on that investment, if that's in fact what's going on, would seem huge. And this has actually prompted people to ask, why isn't there more money in politics? Why wouldn't other people, if this is the kind of the rate of return that you get on investment, that beats putting your money in the savings account, I can tell you that much, or investing in the stock market. Invest in politics. The payoffs are potentially enormous. And that's somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but still it's a valid kind of question. If in fact these are political favors, what's it in return for? Well, not very much. And that's what kind of prompts it on that side of thing. And then I think more generically, if you think of money in politics as primarily going to political speech, right? Primarily by candidates, or now increasingly by third parties who are either talking about candidates or policy issues. Political speech holds a very special place, certainly in America, but in democracies in general, right? This is precious stuff, right? And so, is there such a thing as too much political speech in a democracy, right? And to the extent money is required to fund that speech, that's an interesting question. I mean, obviously it gets balanced by concerns about corruption, but it is the fundamental question to the extent money translates primarily into political speech. And the Supreme Court has made that connection reasonably explicit back in the 70s again. They didn't say money is speech, but they said, for all practical purposes in today's mass media world, you really can't deliver political speech in any effective way without spending some money. And so when you limit the amount of money in politics, one very direct consequence is you are effectively limiting the amount of speech, and not just any speech, political speech in a democracy.